In international politics, sometimes a single decision becomes a turning point that changes the entire course of events. Such a turning point is how experts describe the latest steps of Donald Trump's administration, which have finally destroyed US-India relations. The new round of the trade war, the introduction of 50% tariffs on Indian goods, was perceived by Indian businesses as both a betrayal and a direct threat to the country's economy. According to the Financial Times, in just the first weeks after the tariffs were introduced, Indian exports to the US dropped by dozens of percent, especially in textiles, pharmaceuticals, and IT services. Companies that had worked with the American market for decades were left in shock. In New Delhi, officials make it clear they will not tolerate this indefinitely. As the Economic Times notes, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government is discussing measures aimed not just at responding to Washington, but at striking directly at Trump's administration. India's main trump card is pharmaceuticals. For Americans, this is a highly vulnerable spot. More than 40% of the generic drugs used in the US are produced in India. According to Bloomberg Intelligence, India is the largest supplier of antibiotics, anti-diabetic drugs, and even components used to treat cardiovascular diseases. That is why New Delhi's decision to restrict the production of certain medicines is perceived in Washington as both shocking and extremely dangerous. The Indian government stresses that this is not about banning life-saving drugs such as insulin or cancer treatments. However, the supply of dozens of popular medicines, including broad-spectrum antibiotics and painkillers, could be cut within months. As a source in India's Ministry of Commerce told Reuters, the goal is clear. We want the White House to understand that what's at stake are not abstract GDP percentages, but the lives of ordinary Americans. Behind the scenes in India's parliament, the rhetoric is even harsher. A member of the ruling party told the Hindustan Times on condition of anonymity, "We must force Trump to make a choice, either his political ambitions and trade war or the health of American citizens. A true patriot will always choose people's lives. If Trump pushes this to the end, it will seal his reputation." To understand the gravity of the situation, one must grasp why the US is so dependent on Indian pharmaceuticals. Generic drug production is not simply copying original medicines. It involves massive factories, tens of thousands of specialists, from synthetic chemists to engineers and biotechnologists. In India, such enterprises have been built over decades with state support and based on relatively cheap labor. Pharmaceutical clusters in Hyderabad and Gujarat have long become global hubs, where production costs are 30 to 40% lower than in the US. American corporations, such as Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, long ago outsourced parts of their supply chains there. Technically, Washington could try to establish domestic production, but as the Wall Street Journal notes, this would take years and billions of dollars because the necessary infrastructure simply does not exist. Even raw materials for pills, active pharmaceutical ingredients, mostly come from India and China. This means that if New Delhi turns off the tap, American pharmacies will quickly face shortages. According to Politico, the White House is already holding emergency meetings with FDA and health department officials. Options under discussion include emergency licensing, purchases through third countries, and accelerating the launch of domestic production. But officials admit that even in the best-case scenario, this would take months, if not years. Meanwhile, Indian media openly state that restricting drug exports is a political response to Trump, not to the American people. Yet analysts warn that the effect could be devastating. Any reduction in supplies would trigger higher drug prices in the US, hitting millions of patients, especially those who already struggle to afford treatment. According to experts at the Brookings Institution, this move could become one of the boldest instruments of pressure in the history of trade wars. For the first time, India is using neither tariffs nor sanctions, but control over a vital sphere, medicine. This is not just an economic lever, but almost humanitarian blackmail. The reaction inside the United States is also mixed. Some Republican politicians are demanding that Trump immediately punish India by increasing tariffs and restricting visas for Indian IT specialists. But Democrats are already using the situation as an argument against the White House. The president has put millions of Americans at risk for the sake of his political rhetoric. This is unacceptable. one senator told CNN on condition of anonymity. In expert circles, there is a growing sense that India has crossed a red line. But at the same time, more and more analysts say that now the true face of Donald Trump will be revealed. Will he choose to continue confrontation, risking the health of his own citizens? Or will he finally sit down at the negotiating table? Do you support India's decision to take such a risky step? Some call it a desperate but fair response to tariffs. Others see it as a dangerous game in which millions of patients become hostages. One way or another, the world is once again witnessing how a trade war turns into a matter of life and death. India's response to US tariffs has triggered a chain reaction that goes far beyond a bilateral conflict. According to Nikkei Asia, behind closed doors, BRICS countries are already discussing the creation of a medical alliance, with India as the main supplier of cheap medicines to Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe, if the American market closes. For New Delhi, this is a chance to cement its status as the pharmacy of the world. The paradox is that it was the United States itself that encouraged India for decades to develop its pharmaceutical industry, since cheap pills helped keep healthcare costs down in America. But now, this factor has turned against Washington. Insiders in the Indian government told The Hindu that the plan to restrict production was being developed back in the spring, when the first rumors about Trump's tariffs began to leak to the press. Over several months, India's Ministries of Health and Industry secretly compiled lists of drugs whose exports could be restricted without threatening domestic needs. The key criterion was to strike a balance between political impact and maintaining reputation. New Delhi understands perfectly well. If the US accuses India of creating a humanitarian crisis, it will damage its international image. That is why the list is divided into categories, from mass antibiotics and painkillers to antiviral drugs. Some of their production can indeed be restricted, but supplies of medicines for treating chronic diseases are to remain untouched. Meanwhile, in India itself, the decision is being presented as a historic moment. The Times of India ran a bold headline: New Delhi uses medicine as a weapon for the first time. In the streets of major cities, from Mumbai to Delhi, rallies are being held in support of the government's hard line. Many business people and ordinary citizens believe that India has been a hostage to American markets for too long, and that it is time to show strength. On social media, the hashtag Pills for Power is gaining popularity, already becoming a symbol of the new policy, pills as the weapon of the 21st century. Some experts compare the situation to the gas conflict between Russia and Europe. Only instead of energy resources, the stakes now are medicines. In both cases, it is a strategic resource without which life is impossible. And this is precisely what makes India's move so dangerous and at the same time so effective. The question now stands starkly: do you support India's decision? Some commentators on social media call it a smart and courageous response to unfair tariffs. Others say it is a dangerous game with people's lives. But in any case, the world has witnessed how Trump's trade war has turned into a crisis that could strike not at economies, but at the hearts and lungs of millions of patients.